The DBT skill that stops suffering in its tracks. There is a specific kind of suffering that has nothing to do with what is actually happening, and everything to do with our resistance to it. You know this suffering. It lives in the part of your mind that keeps cycling back to what should have been different. The decision that shouldn't have been made. The diagnosis that shouldn't have come. The person who shouldn't have left. The thing that happened that you would give anything to go back and undo. And the suffering is not coming from the event itself anymore, it is coming from the relentless, exhausting, entirely futile project of fighting the fact that it happened. Marsha Linehan, the psychologist who developed Dialectical Behavior Therapy and who built her life's work around the question of how people survive unbearable pain, identified this distinction as one of the most clinically important insights in all of psychological treatment. Pain, she argued, is inevitable. It is part of being human. It is part of being alive in a world where things go wrong, where losses happen, where people hurt each other, where the body breaks down, where circumstances do not cooperate with what we need them to be. Suffering, the particular suffering that comes from non-acceptance, is something else. And it is something that can be changed, not by changing the reality, but by changing our relationship to it. The skill she developed for this is called radical acceptance. And it is one of the most powerful, most frequently misunderstood, most transformative skills in the entire DBT framework. Today we're going all the way into it. What radical acceptance actually is, which requires first being very clear about what it is not. Where it comes from in Linehan's theory and in the broader intellectual tradition she drew on. Why the mind resists it so powerfully and what that resistance is actually protecting. How to practice it, at the level of thought, body, and behavior. And what becomes available when radical acceptance moves from a technique you use occasionally to a fundamental orientation toward life. A cheat sheet covering all of this is linked in the description. Let's start with the foundation. Section 1. What is radical acceptance? The DBT Foundation. In DBT, radical acceptance is classified under the distress tolerance module, the set of skills designed not to change a painful situation but to help a person survive it without making it worse. And this placement is itself instructive, because it tells us something important about what radical acceptance is for. It is for moments when the situation cannot be immediately changed, and the only variable available is how the person relates to it. Linehan defines radical acceptance as the complete and total acceptance of reality, of the facts of a situation, with one's mind, one's heart, and one's body. The word radical is doing specific work here. It does not mean extreme in the colloquial sense. It comes from the Latin radix, meaning root or foundation. Radical acceptance means accepting all the way down. Not partial acceptance, not conditional acceptance, not acceptance in the abstract while continuing to fight it internally. Acceptance at the root level of one's experience. The core premise is this: reality is what it is, whether we accept it or not. The past has already happened. The present is already occurring. Refusing to accept it does not change it, it simply adds the suffering of non-acceptance on top of the pain that is already present. Linehan's equation is precise and clinical: pain plus non-acceptance equals suffering. Pain plus acceptance equals pain, which is already hard enough, but without the additional layer of anguish that comes from fighting what cannot be changed. This is the essence of radical acceptance. It is the recognition that accepting reality is not the same as approving of it, consenting to it, or resigning oneself to it forever. It is simply the acknowledgement that what is, is. And that the energy spent refusing to acknowledge it could be redirected towards something that actually has the capacity to change things, namely, the choices available in the present moment. Linehan often used a phrase that has become foundational in DBT teaching: fighting reality causes suffering. Not just pain. Suffering, the extra layer of anguish that our resistance creates. And radical acceptance is the practiced, deliberate, whole person turning toward reality rather than away from it. Section 2. Where it comes from, Linehan, Buddhism, and the biosocial theory. To understand radical acceptance deeply, it helps to understand where Linehan drew it from, because the concept sits at a remarkable intellectual and spiritual intersection. Marsha Linehan developed DBT in the late 1970s and 1980s, originally as a treatment for chronically suicidal women who had not responded to existing behavioral therapies. She was working with people in profound, sustained pain, people whose lives had often been shaped by trauma, invalidation, and a chronic mismatch between their emotional experience and what the world reflected back to them. And she discovered something in her clinical work that became the dialectical heart of the entire model. Pure change-focused therapy was causing harm. Pushing clients to change their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors while not acknowledging the reality and validity of their current experience produced dropout, crisis, and therapeutic rupture. What was needed alongside the push for change was something else entirely: genuine, radical, unqualified acceptance. The philosophical framework she reached for was Buddhist philosophy, specifically the concept of accepting suffering as part of the human condition and the practice of non-attachment to outcomes. Linehan trained in Zen practice and was profoundly influenced by the contemplative tradition's understanding that suffering is amplified by clinging to the way things were, to the way we wanted them to be, to the insistence that reality conform to our preferences. The acceptance piece of DBT is not merely cognitive. It has a meditative, whole-body quality that reflects this influence directly. The biosocial theory, Linehan's framework for understanding the origins of the emotional dysregulation that DBT treats, is also essential context for radical acceptance. In the biosocial model, chronic emotional suffering develops through the transaction between a biologically sensitive person and a pervasively invalidating environment, an environment that consistently communicates that the person's emotions are wrong, too much, disproportionate, or simply not real. The child who grew up having their emotional reality denied learns, at the deepest level, not to accept their own experience as valid. Radical acceptance, in this light, is not just a distress tolerance technique. It is a profound corrective to a lifetime of learned self-invalidation. It is the practice of turning toward one's own reality, including one's own emotional experience, with the acknowledgement that it is exactly what it is. Linehan herself has spoken openly about her own history with severe mental suffering and the role that acceptance, in a deeply personal, spiritual sense, played in her own recovery. This is not incidental to the model. DBT is not a set of techniques that Linehan developed from a clinical distance. It is, in part, the distillation of what she learned about surviving unbearable reality. And radical acceptance is at its center. Section 3. What radical acceptance is not. Radical acceptance is among the most misunderstood concepts in all of DBT, and the misunderstanding is both understandable and important to address directly, because it is the primary reason people refuse to attempt it or abandon it before it has a chance to work. The four most common and most damaging misunderstandings are these. First, radical acceptance is not approval. Accepting that something happened is categorically not the same as saying it was okay, justified, or that you are not allowed to be angry about it. You can fully accept that an abuse occurred, you can acknowledge it as the reality of your history, while simultaneously holding that it was profoundly wrong and that the person who committed it bears responsibility. Acceptance is descriptive, not evaluative. It speaks to what is or was, not to whether it should have been. When people resist radical acceptance, they very often believe they are being asked to say the situation was fine. They are not. They are being asked to stop spending energy arguing with the fact that it happened, which is different in every important way. Second, radical acceptance is not resignation. It does not mean giving up, lying down, or deciding that nothing can change. In fact, Linehan is explicit on this point. Radical acceptance is often the precondition for effective action. When you are spending all of your cognitive and emotional energy refusing to acknowledge reality, there is very little left for the work of actually changing what can be changed. Radical acceptance frees up resources. It turns the gaze from what cannot be undone toward what can still be done. Resignation says nothing matters and nothing can change. Radical acceptance says this is what is true right now, and from this place of clear-eyed acknowledgement, what is my wisest next step? Third, radical acceptance is not a feeling. It is a practice and a decision. People frequently report that they intellectually understand radical acceptance but cannot make themselves feel it, and they conclude from this that they have failed at it or that it is not available to them. This misunderstands the nature of what is being asked. Radical acceptance is not the feeling of peace about reality. It is the choice to stop fighting it. You can practice radical acceptance while still feeling grief, anger, sadness, or devastation about what you're accepting. The emotions are allowed. The fighting is what you are releasing. And fourth, radical acceptance is not a one-time event. It is not a threshold you cross once after which acceptance is permanent. Reality changes, and with it, the practice continues. The same reality may need to be accepted again tomorrow, and the day after that, particularly when what is being accepted is something that was genuinely terrible. Each time the mind rises up in protest against what is, the practice of radical acceptance is available again. It is not a destination. It is a repeated turning. Section 4. Why the mind resists acceptance so fiercely. If radical acceptance is so clearly the pathway out of unnecessary suffering, why is it so extraordinarily difficult to practice? This is not a trivial question, and it does not have a trivial answer. The mind's resistance to acceptance is not stupidity or weakness. It has its own logic. And understanding that logic is one of the most important things we can do to work with it rather than against it. The first reason the mind resists is the belief, usually implicit and often quite deep, that not accepting something is a form of protest that carries moral weight. That to accept that a harm occurred is to betray the person who was harmed, to diminish the gravity of what was done, to let the perpetrator off the hook. There is a sense in which continued suffering feels like testimony, like the most honest response to something that was genuinely wrong. If I stopped suffering about this, does it mean it didn't matter? If I accept it, am I saying it was okay? In DBT we are very direct about this. Your suffering is not testimony. Your non-acceptance does not change what happened, hold anyone accountable, or honor the wrongness of the situation. What it does is keep you in pain. Anger and grief can coexist with acceptance. Justice and accountability can be pursued from a place of acceptance. The suffering of non-acceptance is not required to prove that what happened was real and wrong. The second reason the mind resists is the terror of grief. Not accepting something is, among other things, a way of not fully entering the loss. Because if you accept it, really accept it, all the way down, then you have to feel what it actually means that this is true. And for many people, particularly those who grew up in environments where grief was not safe or not modeled, the prospect of that full feeling is more threatening than the continued anguish of fighting. Radical acceptance, in this sense, opens the door to grief. And grief, as any honest clinician knows, is not pleasant, even as it is necessary. The mind that has been resisting acceptance has often been protecting itself from a grief it does not trust itself to survive. Part of the therapeutic work with radical acceptance is building enough trust in the person's own resilience, and enough support in the therapeutic relationship, that entering the grief becomes possible. The third reason is the cognitive confusion between acceptance and powerlessness. If I accept this, then I'm just giving up. If I stop fighting it, I'm admitting I have no control. This is the resignation misunderstanding in its most felt form, the visceral experience, not just the intellectual one, that letting go of the fight means letting go of any possibility of things being different. DBT addresses this directly through the dialectic at the center of the entire model, the synthesis of acceptance and change. Acceptance does not eliminate change. It is the foundation from which effective change becomes possible. You can accept a reality and also take every available action to address it. These are not contradictory. They are, in Linen's framework, deeply and necessarily complementary. Section 5. The levels of radical acceptance. One of the most important clinical refinements in how radical acceptance is taught in DBT is the recognition that acceptance is not a single act, but operates at multiple levels simultaneously, and that genuine radical acceptance requires working at all of them. The first level is cognitive acceptance, the acknowledgement in the mind that this is what is true. This is often the first place people begin, and it is genuinely important. The cognitive acknowledgement that the reality exists, that it cannot be undone, that the facts are the facts, this is necessary. But it is not sufficient. Anyone who has ever intellectually known something while their gut continues to fight it understands that cognitive acknowledgement without deeper integration is a beginning, not a destination. The second level is emotional acceptance, allowing yourself to feel what the reality actually evokes, without using non-acceptance as a buffer against those feelings. This is often the hardest level, because it is where the grief, the anger, the sadness, the fear, whatever the authentic emotional response to the reality is, actually get felt rather than fought around. Emotional acceptance requires a willingness to be moved by what is true, to let it matter in the way it actually matters, without minimizing it and without amplifying it into something more than it is. Just feeling it fully, without the protective layer of not yet accepting that it is real. The third level is physical or somatic acceptance, the letting go of the bodily bracing that non-acceptance produces. When the mind fights reality, the body fights alongside it. Tension in the jaw, the chest, the shoulders, a constriction in the breath, a chronic activation in the nervous system that keeps the organism in a low-level state of resistance. Somatic acceptance is the practice of noticing this physical bracing and intentionally releasing it. Linehan and DBT practitioners often use specific physical practices for this: relaxing the facial muscles, unclenching the hands, softening the breath, allowing the body to take on the posture of willingness rather than resistance. The body has its own form of non-acceptance, and it needs its own form of practice. And the fourth level is behavioral acceptance, acting in ways that are consistent with acceptance rather than ways that maintain the fantasy of a different reality. This might mean stopping the behaviors that express non-acceptance, the repeated conversations rehashing what should have been different, the avoidance of reminders of the reality, the continued attempts to get an apology that is not coming or a change that is not happening. Behavioral acceptance does not mean passivity. It means that your actions are oriented toward the reality of what is rather than the reality you wish were true. Section 6. How to actually practice at radical acceptance is not only a concept to be understood. It is a skill to be practiced, repeatedly, imperfectly, and with patient self-compassion. Here is how DBT approaches the actual practice. The first step is observing the resistance. Before you can practice acceptance, you need to notice non-acceptance when it is happening. What does it feel like in your body when you are fighting reality? What thoughts accompany it? The should-haves, the if-onlys, the this isn't fair, the I cannot believe this happened. Non-acceptance has a distinctive texture and it is worth getting to know. Mindful observation of the resistance, without immediately trying to fix or change it, is the beginning of the practice. The second step is the cognitive turn, the deliberate, chosen acknowledgement that this is what is true. In DBT, this is sometimes practiced as a statement said inwardly or aloud: this is the reality. This happened. This is what is true right now. Not this is okay. Not this is what I wanted. Simply, this is what is true. The statement is not made once. It is made as many times as the mind rises up in protest, which, for genuinely painful realities, may be many, many times. The third step is the body practice. When you have named the reality and the mind has acknowledged it, turn toward the physical expression of resistance. Linen's phrase for the physical practice of radical acceptance is half-smiling and willing hands, a gentle upward turn of the lips and the opening of the hands, palms up. This may sound almost absurdly simple. It is not. The physical posture of willingness shifts the nervous system's relationship to the moment in ways that purely cognitive shifts often cannot. The body leads and the mind follows, at least as often as the reverse. The fourth step is grieving. When you turn toward what is true and release the fight against it, emotion moves. Let it. The grief, the anger, the sadness, these are not evidence that acceptance has failed. They are evidence that it is working. Acceptance opens the door to the feelings that non-acceptance was keeping at bay, and those feelings need to move through the system rather than being managed around indefinitely. The fifth step is recommitting to the present moment. What choices are available to me right now, in this reality? What action, if any, makes sense from this place? What is mine to do today? This is where radical acceptance connects directly to effective living. The question of what is actually possible now, given what is true, becomes answerable in a way it was not while the mind was occupied with fighting what cannot be changed. And the sixth step, the one that is most easily overlooked, is practicing self-compassion for how difficult this is. Radical acceptance of genuinely hard things is not supposed to be easy. The invitation is not to spiritual bypass, to leap from the pain to peace while skipping the very real difficulty of the middle. It is to do the hard thing with kindness toward yourself for how hard it is. Section 7. When reality is genuinely unbearable. I want to speak directly to the hardest version of this, because this video would be incomplete without it. There are realities that are not merely uncomfortable or inconvenient. There are realities that are genuinely, devastatingly terrible. The death of a child. A diagnosis that changes everything. An abuse that should never have happened. A loss so fundamental it reshapes the entire landscape of a life. And I want to be honest about what radical acceptance asks of people in those circumstances, and what it does not ask. It does not ask you to feel okay about it. It does not ask you to arrive at peace quickly or on any particular timeline. It does not ask you to pretend that what is devastating is manageable, or that the scale of the loss is smaller than it actually is. Radical acceptance in the face of genuine tragedy does not look like serenity. It looks like being willing to let the full weight of what is true land, without running from it, without insulating yourself from it with the extra suffering of non-acceptance, but without any requirement that you feel anything other than what you actually feel. Linehan was not a stranger to unbearable reality. Her clinical population included people who were surviving things that most people will never face. And her insistence on radical acceptance was not a comfortable prescription from someone who had never been tested by it. It was the hard-won insight of someone who understood, at a very personal level, that reality's weight does not decrease when you fight it. It only increases. For the realities that are genuinely too large to accept in a single practice, DBT offers the concept of accepting one moment at a time. You do not have to accept the entire weight of a devastating reality all at once. You accept this moment. This breath. This specific, present fact. And then the next moment. And then the next. This is not a shortcut. It is a doorway, a way of making the practice of acceptance small enough to be survivable when the full weight is not yet something the system can hold. And it bears saying clearly, for realities in this category, genuinely traumatic, genuinely life-altering losses, radical acceptance is not a solo practice. It is work that is best done with the support of a skilled therapist who can hold the space while the full weight of what is true is gradually, compassionately, allowed to land. The cheat sheet linked in the description is a tool for this work. It is not a substitute for that support. Radical acceptance is one of those concepts that sounds simple until the moment it asks something real of you. And then it reveals itself as one of the most challenging and most profound practices available to the human mind. What Marsha Linehan gave us with this skill, drawn from her clinical genius, her Buddhist practice, and her own lived experience of surviving unbearable pain, is a framework for the one thing we cannot change our way out of: the fact that reality is what it is. That the past has already happened. That certain losses are real and permanent. That some things will not be different no matter how long or how hard we fight them. And the invitation is not to like this. It is not to feel peaceful about it. It is simply to stop adding your own suffering to the pain that is already there. To put down the fight with what cannot be changed. To free your hands and your mind and your heart for what actually can. That is radical acceptance. And it is available to you, not as a destination you arrive at once and never have to find again, but as a practice you return to, again and again, in every moment when reality asks you to meet it as it is. The Radical Acceptance cheat sheet is in the description. Everything we covered today in one clean reference, with practice prompts and a guide to the common obstacles. It's there for your own practice and for therapists teaching this skill to clients. If this video gave you something useful, share it with someone who is spending their energy fighting what has already happened. And I'll see you in the next one.